Okay, so this presentation is going to examine Chapter 8 of Conway's Principles of Most Ancient and Modern Philosophy, and it primarily focuses on her perspective of what the relationship between body and soul is, and whether these two are separate entities bound together by something, or something a bit more complex that are entangled, and something that we may not yet understand. So her main point is that the body and soul are not two entirely separate entities, but beings that rely upon each other for life. They're conjoined as a singular creation of God. And the way she chooses to address this is using the Socratic method of asking rhetorical questions that rely on the premise of the separation of these two entities to actually be true. So we'll see in a bit that she asks several questions that fundamentally assume that separation of body and soul to be true. And as she continues on that assumption, eventually she gets to a point where she begins to contradict herself, which is her point in saying that that assumption can't be true. And one of the more interesting parts of the chapter is her callback to a previous chapter in which she discusses the Christian belief of Jesus Christ as a medium between people and God. And the Christian foundation is that Jesus is able to take the impure souls of humans and send them to heaven. Humans would not be able to get and connect with God without a medium because he is infinitely good, powerful, and present. So if human souls were separate from body, then after death, the soul would hold no attachment to sin or impurity, meaning that they would easily be able to connect with God. So obviously that can't be true because Jesus Christ has the role of being a mediator between the two. So she begins the argument basically saying she has 6 main points that'll kind of deconstruct the myth of a soul having a union with a body. And she starts off with the premise of if a spirit is beyond the physical realm of matter and a body is the grouping of matter, what is it that chains these two things together? So we have physical flesh as our body, and we are holding spirit as an abstract entity or concept. What is it that binds these two together? What is keeping one attached to the other? Because obviously it can't be something physical, so there'd be no way it can connect to our body. And it can't be non-physical because it wouldn't be able to connect to the spirit. Another example is when the spirit is separated from the body in death, what is the catalyst for this? So the separation theory relies on that when death occurs, the spirit will be removed from the body and eventually united with God. However, that kind of implies that there were chains there in the first place. So let's say we somehow were able to conjure up a chain that was able to both connect to the spirit and body, what would separate them? And if a body is void of life without a soul, what is the agreement these two have that bounds the soul to it? Because a body obviously can't speak for itself or make decisions for itself or be self-aware, but yet we are predicating that there's a bound between these two entities. And realistically, this only limits the soul. If it were able to think for itself and act for itself, why would it bound itself to the human flesh and desires and emotions and limitations? And her callback to the Messiah, medium, Jesus Christ aspect is that our souls are inherently impure. If they were able to separate from the body after death, they would be pure and they'd be able to easily unite with God. However, because Jesus Christ was sent as a mediator and a medium, we know that can't be true. So there has to be a more complex answer to this question because it implies that souls will have evil details and positive details and good and bad. So it can't be a simplistic separation of the two. And logically, it's kind of fascinating the way she brings this up way back then, that if the earth started out as, rock and water and fire, eventually life forms. So if a soul is within a creature bound to a body, and eventually we have mammals and fish on Earth, that soul must have descended to another soul, descended to another soul, descended to another soul. So why do we see these variations, or as she refers to it, corruptions in species? Obviously, fish evolved into mammals. We have plants. We have birds. So obviously, if there was only one soul, why do we have so many variations in our cycles of life? And the natural concept of that is that there may be, in her perspective, multiple souls inside each body that will divide and disperse. So Carl asks, how does blood transform into spirit? Because blood is tangible, but obviously spirit isn't. And the clearest understanding of that is to look back on her quote that all motion wears and divides, and so renders a thing subtle and spiritual. And what this means is that over time, she sees the universe acting in a way that everything leads to the division and the breaking down of all things, in the sense that if we eat food and drink water, our stomach's going to break that down into something that we can digest, and that is breaking down into what she refers to as chyle. That's sent into our bloodstream because it has nutrients and sugar, and we are able to live and make decisions and act because of that blood. So that's the point where she refers to blood being made pure, because these actions and these decisions and emotions, they aren't concrete, but they came from somewhere. So obviously our blood is transformed to spirits. And Ryan asks, if God controls the seas and the skies, how can we blame the captain for wrecking the ship, as Conway suggests? And on the surface, it does seem a bit puzzling, because a captain's simple mistake doesn't necessarily seem like an evil action, but her analogy of sin doesn't necessarily require sin to always be evil. Sin could simply be a miscalculation. It can be a shortcoming, it can be a simple mistake, but that still holds true of a miscalculation in the captain sinning because he made an imperfect decision. In that way, he is sinful and he's imperfect. So God gave people the power to make their decisions, but people's corruption and abuse of that power is what creates sin.